Thank you.
One quick question. Okay. Good morning. That is final resting place. And I was speaking once in a church in South Sudan. Bats came along the back of my shoulders and climbed up into my head. And bats can cling. And everybody was watching instead of listening. Okay, let's just pray again. I know we just prayed. Let's ask the Lord to speak to us this morning. We've got a very somber passage to look at. I think it's the best way to describe it. We're going to talk about the wrath of God. I'll try to pronounce that properly. I don't want to get Silas terminated saying wrong. That's his name. So we'll try and pronounce it the way you pronounce it in America. Wrath. Let's pray. Father, we do turn to your word, and we do so in the spirit of humility and submission. We go on to bring your word under the judgment of our own minds. We want to bring our minds under the judgment and instruction of your word. We pray that the Holy Spirit who inspired this book and gave it to us will be the one who interprets it to us in a way that is challenging, but also liberating and freeing to be who you want us to be. We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. We're going to cover the last part of Romans 1 in this session. And it's where Paul writes about the judgment and the wrath of God. I think if you keep the door open, it'll probably get it find its way out.
That way, Mom. You want to say that way?
That way.
That way.
Almost.
Yes. No. No one from your shirt.
No one's because that's your job. You're the flight.
Okay, you said that way.
That way. You get those lights.
Just grab it. Ben, that was your one opportunity to grab it. Ben, no, you're Ben. No, Ben. Let's go. No, that way, Mom. That way. That way. No, Ben. That way, Mom. That way.
No, this is scary.
That way, Mom.
Bird. Did you read?
Go.
Not here.
That way, Mom.
Be here.
Alright. I'm here. But I'm scared sad for you. You've been here all night. It's okay. He's gonna die alone.
Hey guys, let's wrap it. I just want to say that this is going to be a distraction.
I think you'll find his own way out. You'll smell the fresh air in this room.
Okay. That.
Don't rush.
One moment, please. Sorry. I can see it in my peripheral. Maybe I shouldn't wear my glasses. Okay. It's like this is.
All right, that's cool.
It's like it's I think I backed up into it.
All right, let me remind you where we've been so far.
Maybe swat it. He's a friend of mine.
This was never a track, and this like keeps going.
Okay, let's see.
This like it's really good.
Get out.
No, no. He's back on the track. No, ginger bean, ginger bean, ginger bean, ginger bean.
Wow, bro. You started that way. Come on. That box is so stupid.
Come on, just kind of get out.
That's sure.
I do it so you can do a little more.
Mom. Come here, Mom.
I look back at the leg.
I was actually afraid about it. This thing is actually distracting me so much.
Get it, break, get it. Guys! Break attack! Attack, break! Run!
Don't stand in the door.
Do not
Don't stand in the door.
Squad right
Oh, Thank you. Like, we can now
Let me read you verse, okay, Romans chapter 1. Let me read you verse 17 and 18. That's what you're going to look at this morning is a really important one to understand properly. I think it is not always understood well. Verse 17, in the gospel, a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith, from first to last. Just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. Since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, has been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal men and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, the degrading of their bodies with one another, exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even the women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed indecent acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their perversion. Furthermore, since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, he gave them over to a depraved mind to do what ought not to be done. They became filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, dog-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They are senseless, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. One of the darkest passages of the New Testament. And it begins, we looked at this yesterday, in the gospel, a righteousness from God is revealed. That's a kind of past tense sense. It has been revealed. It is revealed. We know about the righteousness of God. But then in verse 18, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven. And this is more in the present tense. This is something that Paul says, and he's going to go on saying, is taking place in the present tense. Now, the wrath of God is not a pleasant subject. It's one that we would like to think doesn't exist because God is love and God is kind and God is understanding and God is merciful. So when we mess up, He understands all about it. And like that song said, we just sang, He's the artist who takes all the blotches, the bad things, and makes them into something better. Which of course is true. Our life is given over to God. But let's understand what this text is saying, first of all. Let's talk first about, I'm calling it the provocation of God's wrath. What grounds, on what grounds is God's wrath provoked? And if you look carefully at these verses here that we've already read, you find in verse 18, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Notice that. He says they suppress the truth, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. So the issue there he's concerned about is the suppression of truth. The issue is not the wickedness of people in itself, but their wickedness has come about by suppressing what is actually plain to them, suppressing truth. Now we'll see what he means by that in just a moment. But then we go to verse 21. He says that although they knew God, they neither glorified Him as God nor gave thanks to Him. But their thinking became futile, their foolish hearts were darkened. What he says they knew about God, they didn't respond by saying thank you in recognition and humility and worship. So instead, he says their thinking became corrupted and became futile. Verse 25, they exchanged the truth of God for a lie. Verse 28, since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, and that verse goes on to say then that He gave them over, but we'll look at that a bit later, but they did not retain the knowledge of God. So the issue that Paul talks about here is the suppression of truth. The things that are revealed to people, they suppress them, they squash them, they don't respond to them, they exchange them. All these phrases are ones that he uses. So that begs the question, of course, how has God revealed Himself? Because if the issue is they have suppressed the truth, what has been that revelation that God has given? And the answer is, and we looked at this yesterday, so I won't talk about it anymore now, just very briefly. God has revealed Himself in creation, is his first point. Because in verse 20 of chapter 1, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood what has been made, so that men are without excuse. So the very nature itself, the world itself, is a revelation of the Creator. But because we suppress that, we say that is naive, that is simplistic, you can't really believe that. we suppress that truth and we have to replace it with something else. As we'll see in just a moment. So God revealed himself in creation, we talked last night, and also he revealed himself in conscience. We also talked about that last night, and that's in chapter 2, verse 14. When Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, their law for themselves, even though they don't have the law, since they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. Their consciences also bearing witness, thoughts, now accusing, and now defending them. So these two aspects of God's revelation, creation is external to us, it's out there, you see it. Conscience is internal, it plays within us, and like a what's the word? Like a barometer of some kind. It tells you when you're off track, and we know that it's not just something that is instilled in us as children. It can be distorted, it can be reinforced, but it is there innately within us. Is what he is saying. And so, the issue is not that people don't have a revelation of God. They have that in conscience, in creation, and in conscience. But they suppress that truth they have been given. And so, I just reinforce the verses I've already shown you. They suppress the truth in verse 18. They refuse to give thanks to God in verse 21. They exchange the truth of God for a lie in verse 25. And they fail to retain knowledge of God in verse 28. And so his charge to them basically is that, let me come over here. Paul's charge against them is that to have a blind eye to creation and a deaf ear to conscience. And as a consequence of that, we're under, he says, the wrath of God. Now, what is meant by that? Well, my first point is the provocation of God's wrath, which I'm on top of the screen there. My second point is the expression of God's wrath. How does God express his wrath? What do we mean by that? Is it God having a tantrum, so to speak? That's the kind of way we usually think of this word. Well, there are three phrases, or a phrase that occurs 3 times. And it is the phrase, God gave them over. That is an important phrase in what he is saying. In verse 24, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts, to spiritual impurity, the degrading of their bodies with one another. Verse 26, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Verse 28, God gave them over to depraved mind, to do what ought not to be done. So, here's the important thing to understand. The way God expresses his wrath is that he gives us over to the logical end of our own choices. God lets you go. If you want to get involved in something that is wrong and your conscience tells you it's wrong, and you know it's wrong, but you intend on doing it anyway, God is not going to stop you. He's going to say, okay, go ahead. He hands us over, is the expression uses here. And he hands us over to the end consequences, which if they are wrong, if the beginning of them is a rejection of what is true, then the end is going to be destructive. And he gives us over to it. He specifies three areas. First of all, sexual impurity. That's the first area he talks about. Like in verse 24, he says, God gave over to the simple desires of their hearts, to sexual impurity, degrading their bodies with one another. Let me come back to the detail. Let me just give you the three areas. First of all, sexual impurity, material idolatry. He talks about those who worship and serve created things. Things designed to serve us, we end up serving them. And then he talks about self-indulgence. It's really intellectual arrogance he talks about in that area. So let me, those are the three areas he says God gives us over to: sexual impurity, material idolatry, self-indulgence, and then we'll look at them one by one. Just so you see the direction of travel. The first one then is sexual impurity, and he makes a general statement first in verse 24. Therefore God gave them over in the simple desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, the degrading of their bodies with one another. That's a general statement. It covers all kinds of what he calls sexual impurity. It's a general phrase. But then he specifically mentions lesbianism in verse 26. Women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones, is how he describes it. But what is natural, what is unnatural. And then he talks about male homosexuality in verse 27, where he says, in the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for other men, and men committed indecent acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their perversion. In other words, there were consequences that came out of this. Now, let me just take an aside for a moment. Paul is writing to the church in Rome, this letter, and there's lots of documentary evidence that homosexuality was rampant in Roman society. There's lots of sources of information about that. I mean, bisexuality was commonplace. Married men would often keep younger male concubines. There is much less record of lesbianism in the Roman Empire, but Paul refers to it here, so clearly it existed, but there's less historical record of that, partly because history was very biased towards the man anyway, and the men's story, as opposed to women's story, so that could well be one reason why there's more documentation about men being involved in same-sex relationships. But I say that Paul is not speaking theoretically about something here. He's talking about a specific situation that was rampant in Rome. However, it would be a mistake to treat this passage as a treatise on homosexuality. Paul isn't saying, okay, I'm going to write you about homosexuality. He's saying, I'm writing you about what happens when God hands you over to the sins that you choose to keep. Your favorite sins, your pet sins, the things that you enjoy. What happens? That's the point he's making. And he says that he won't stop you. He will hand you over. Let me just say for a moment, because homosexuality is a very real thing, of course. I mean, same-sex attraction is something that many folks experience, not because they choose to. We had a work in the church out there in Toronto with 50 gay young men, and I talked to many who were suicidal over this, pleading with God, God, change it, take it away. He said, well, what are your issues you struggle with? And a few years ago, I was invited to go and speak at a conference of gay Christians from all across Europe. We met in Belgium, and people came from Poland in the east, and Ireland in the west, and Norway in the north, Spain in the south, more of Europe, men and women. And when they wrote to me and said, will you come and speak to us at this conference, I said, I'm not sure I know enough to speak well about these issues, and no, please don't even mention these issues. One of my books had been translated into Dutch, and there was a group in Amsterdam who were using it as a basis of study. And they said, will you come and teach the substance of this book, which is how to live in union with Christ and enjoy His presence in us and through us and so on. So sure, we got to come and do that. And so I went. It was a great experience. It was a whole week. And there was about 80% were male, 20% were female. The basic position that this organization, it had its groups in many of these countries, but they had this international body as well, was that we want to be realistic about the fact that we struggle with same-sex attraction. We're tired of praying about it because it hasn't changed a thing. Many would say that. But we believe we have to live with this, but in a godly way. That was their position. So the guy who led the conference on the first night, he said that we meet here, all of us, with something in common. He said, what we have in common is that we're broken people. He said, no, we have in common the whole humanity. Everybody broken. We are broken in a particular way, and we share in common that particular way. We're broken sexually. And for some of us, there are reasons for that, and you explain those reasons, and how people give testimonies, and a lot of abuse is taking place amongst people, the young, the factor, etc., etc. But what we are seeking to do is to live godly lives without denying ourselves or pretending we're not who we are. And it was a very refreshing event, and now more in Europe probably than in North America. A lot of Christians do this, and I am same-sex attracted, and I'm a Christian. And my biggest problem is hiding it, so I'm not going to hide it anymore. And there are networks now of folks who say, this is who I am, this is where I struggle. I want to live a godly life, and I'm seeking to live celibate lives, etc. And I know a number of folks involved in the private school where I was principal for some years in North England. A guy comes in and does a number of days on this issue and spends a lot of time counseling folks who are struggling in this area. So I recognize the reality of the issue, the difficulty. We have folks in Toronto that I work with who were suicidal over this issue because they wanted to please God, and yet they felt all my pull is in the direction I know is wrong. And some of them couldn't cope with it, and some of them are the ones who are married to the same sex people as well. And that's the choice that they made. And they do that. Now, I mention that as an aside because that is not what Romans 1 is about. It's not. This is the treatise on homosexuality. This is the treatise on what happens if you God said it, I don't like it, I'm going to go another way. And what happens is that as that he prays and what he gives us over. Again, this is verse I just gave you. He gave them over. This is not just in areas of homosexuality or lesbianism or sexual impurity, which covers a multiplicity of things, but also in materialism. He talks about if you're going to serve created things rather than created, you're going to be driven by money and materialism, and also the ego, claim to be wise but actually fools, and so on. He talks about all these things. He says God's wrath in these things is that he doesn't send a thunderbolt and scare you silly, but he let you go. So if a Christian guy decides he's going to get involved in an adulterous relationship with another woman, on his drive home after the encounter, God isn't going to make his car smash into a tree and kill him. He'll probably think maybe he will. If I've done something wrong. No, God won't do that. He said he will let you go. But you will reap consequences. You will reap consequences, he said. We'll come to that in just a moment. Let me just show you another passage where the same kind of thing occurs. 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 1 to 5, you won't read it, but there's a man in the church who is sleeping with his father's wife, which presumably is his stepmother. And what Paul says about that man is, this shouldn't be happening, but what he says is, hand this man over. Now, it's exactly the same phrase is used in Romans, that God will hand people over. Hand this man over to Satan because he's acting in disobedience, he's obeying Satan, so that his sinful nature, that's his flesh, or it could read his body, because the literal is the NIV, which translates his sinful nature, and he would also translate body, so his body may be destroyed, his spirit saved in the day of the Lord. Notice he'll poison himself by acting sinfully. Though he says the guy's still going to be saved, but he said put him out of the church because he's acting in this way that it's going to be self-destructive. And sexual sin is always destructive in some sense because it violates the way we were created, which is why he says they received the due penalty. And here's the principle. It's a verse from the book of Numbers, 32, verse 23. And this principle writes through all of this. He says, if you fail to do this, the context isn't important at all. If you fail to do this, you'll be sinning against the Lord, and you may be sure your sin will find you out. Your sin will do you damage. He's not saying there, if you continue in this way, your wife will find you out, or the cops will find you out, or your parents will find you out, or the neighbor will find you out. No, they may know nothing about it, but the sin itself will find you out. The sin itself will be damaged. Because as there are physical laws in creation, so there are moral laws as well. You see, if you say to a kid, if you jump off the roof, you'll hit the ground and break a few bones. Now, then when you say to the child, so you mustn't jump off the roof, you're not being unkind and judgmental. You're saving them from inevitable consequences. Because if you jump off the roof, you're going to be subject to some physical laws and you're going to break some bones. You jump off the law, you'll be handed over to the law of gravity and you'll get hurt. And God won't stop you on your way down from the roof and make you land gently. No, you'll get damaged. That's the kind of thing Paul is saying here. You'll hand you over, okay, if you don't get off the roof, you want to violate the moral laws that God has created in the universe, the moral laws of which we have an inner conscience about them, if you want to violate them, you will get broken. You will get hurt. So God's judgment is not saying, I'm going to hurt you if you do something wrong. That isn't his judgment. Or his wrath. His wrath is, if you do it, you'll hurt yourself. But I won't stop you. I won't stop you. The wrath of God is, he will let you go. He hands us over. Hand this man over to Satan. Earlier, as you read, verse 3 says, hand him over. If you engage in sexual immorality, you'll be handed over to a law of sin, and you'll have the thrill of the moment, but you'll get the pain that will last for a lifetime. So the moral law will catch you up and break you. And you said, well, I don't like this is unfavorable. That's like saying, I don't like the law of gravity. I think we should change that. I think it's unfair God made the law of gravity. It doesn't change the physics so it's okay to jump off the roof. Let's change the moral law so it's okay to do things that we would like to do. Well, we can't change the physical laws to change the law of gravity. That would mess up the whole existence of our world, which is finely tuned on physical laws. And so it is on moral law. If you break the moral law, you'll break us. I was sitting in Toronto Airport about 2 years ago now. There's a guy and his wife and his daughter who was a teenager. She was about 18, I guess, 17, 18. And I'd forgotten how the conversation started. But we were waiting for our plane, and he said one or two things to me that were true about me, and I didn't know how he knew that. And I looked at my carry-on bag, because there's something that gives away the evidence. And I said, that's pretty smart. How do you know that? He said, is it true? I said, yes, it is. I think he said. And then we talked a bit long, and he said, will you happen to be a pastor? I said, what do you ask me that? He said, I don't know. I'm just asking. You can't be a pastor. I said, but we met before. He said, no. I said, I actually am a pastor, yes. He said, I thought you might be. So then his daughter began to giggle a bit. And I said, what's going on? She said, you always does this. I said, why? I said, you're a mind reader. He said, no. I said, what's your job? He said, I'm a cop. I said, interesting. He said, yes, I'll tell you what I do. He said, I'm a human polygraph. You know, a polygraph is a lie detector. A detector. And a polygraph, I don't know if you've ever tried, anybody ever tried a lie detector? I had a friend who used to manage a lie detector. I said, okay, see if you can count me out. So he asked me a question, I told him the lie, he said lie. So I took my time and constant rules. He told me the truth, honestly. Really constant. Okay, lie. He said, really good. He said, these aren't admissible evidence in court. Polygraph. But we're interrogating a criminal. He said, I sit in the room and I say nothing. I just observe the person. And I know when he lies. I said, how do you know when he lies? He said, because human beings are made to tell the truth. And when we don't tell the truth, something happens to us. And I've learned that it's physiological, it's emotional, it's psychological. When you tell a lie, you violate yourself, he said to me. I said, man, you sound like you could be a preacher. No, he said, I don't believe that kind of stuff. But he said, it's actually true. And I said, well, actually, it is true. The Bible speaks of being true as well. by lying, we get away with something. You see, you never get away with anything by lying. You never get away by lying. You may get away from something, but that lie will damage you. And that is really what Paul is writing in this passage. And see how he uses this word exchange in the passage. I think I pointed there, but they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie. Women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. Men abandoned, meaning the same thing, exchanged natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Verse 8. They did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God. In other words, they exchanged it for lies. Now it says, when they exchange what is good for what is bad, the glory of God for images, truth for a lie, natural relation for unnatural ones, the knowledge of God for falsehoods, it will damage people. What does God do? Does he stand on his big hand and go swank, smack, pow? No. He says, off you go. And you'll reap the consequences. There will be consequences. And that's why everything in your life and my life that we hold on to that's wrong does damage. And that's why this passage is so important. The exchanging of the truth of God for lies leads in this passage to the exchanging of sexual morality for sexual immorality. That was the first issue he talks about. And let me give you something that Stuart Briscoe, if you know that name, Stuart Briscoe. But Stuart Briscoe has written this about this passage. He said, confusion about deity leads to confusion about humanity. In other words, you get God wrong, you get human beings wrong, because we were made to be in his image. You don't know who God is, you don't know who you're supposed to be. So confusion about deity is confusion about humanity. Confusion about humanity leads to confusion about identity. Who am I? And then confusion about identity gives rise to confusion about sexuality. And that's why you can say from this that so much sexual confusion and distortion is actually a theological issue, because we've lost deity, God, in whose image we're made. We've lost the nature of humanity, and therefore we're confused about our identity, therefore we get messed up over our sexuality. Sexual breakdown in our day is the inevitable consequence of exchanging the truth of God for a lie. Now, it's no good going around talking about the symptoms. We do that. I'm not one for complaining and moaning and grumbling and protesting about all the symptoms of this. But that doesn't solve anything. We've got to go back to the cause, which is that people are reconciled God. And move that one off. That's what we're having. Speak about deity. We speak about humanity. Speak about humanity. We speak about destiny. Speaking about identity. Speaking about sexuality. And then verse 32, which sums up this section, though they know God's righteous decree, that those who do these things deserve death, they not only continue these things, but also approve of those who practice them. And so, the principle in handle of this is, you may be sure your sin will find you out. Your sin itself will find you out. You may be sure. Unless, we're going to see this in the next session, unless you bring it to the cross of Jesus Christ. Because he's going to say this is the remedy in the next few, in chapter 3. We'll talk about later. So So if that's the first one, then is sexual immorality. The second one is material idolatry. Just very quickly on this, he says in verse 25, they worship and serve created things rather than the Creator. And I think it was G.K. Chesterton, was it him? One of these guys who said, when people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. People stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. And so they begin to worship and serve created things. And by the way, worship and serve go together. What you worship, you serve. When you serve, you worship. And I think that if you look in history, when materialism is God, sex, beauty becomes the goddess. And that's true in our Western self-indulgent world at the moment. Materialism become God, sex become the goddess, and then we'll say more about that because we haven't got time. And the third area, sexual immorality, material idolatry, self-indulgence, in particular, is intellectual arrogance. He talks about, these down here, you can drop them down, that thinking became futile, the foolish hearts were darkened, no one didn't know they were futile anymore. There's now darkness in their hearts, the foolish hearts darkened. They claimed to be wise because their only measuring stick for that was their own darkened world, and so you establish your own measuring stick for being smart. They claimed to be smart, but they became fools. Exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and lies always let you down. Lies will always confuse and disappoint us. The result is, in verse 28, God gave him over, a phrase again, to betrayed. Maybe it's time to finish. Let me just read you these last verses where he sums up. Verse 29 says, "They became filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, depravity. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They're gossips and slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They're senseless, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only do these very things, they also approve of those who practice them." There are 22 things that he lists there. And without any exaggeration, I think you agree, probably, without exaggeration, this is our day, isn't it? Wickedness, evil, greed, depravity, murder, strife, deceit, malice, we can see this all around us. Tragically. Which means that we as a society, I'm talking about the Western world, I'm not an American, Canadian, different culture, different country, and my roots are British, I'm really European as well, but nevertheless, the things that unite us together is, I think, we exchange truth for life. Under the wrath of God, God is saying, okay, go ahead. And you get the consequences will be natural. Not what you want, but they will be destructive. And the very last thing, if there's the immediate expression of God's wrath, which is He hands you over. That's the immediate expression of God's wrath. There's an ultimate expression of God's wrath. That is, chapter 2, verse 5, because of your stubbornness and unrepentant heart, you stir up wrath against yourself, for the day of God's wrath when His righteous judgment will be revealed. There is going to be a judgment day that is coming. Appointed unto man, it says in Hebrews 10, isn't it? I think it is the verse. It's appointed unto man once to die, after that, the judgment. What is talked about in Romans chapter 1 is the wrath of God here and now in this life, hands us over, go your own way, reap the consequences, shed your tears, experience the brokenness that you have chosen by defying truth and exchanging it for a lie. But ultimately, there will be the day of God's wrath, a judgment day. Here's another couple of verses. Romans 2, verse 6, this is Romans 2 now. God will give to each person according to what he has done. Chapter 2, verse 16. This will take place on the day when God will judge men's secrets through Jesus Christ, as my gospel declares. So, that's not a subject for us to talk about now, the day of judgment. Unfortunately, have to be limited. I want the main thrust of Romans to leave you with. And so, if I finish with a quick summary of the second half of Romans chapter 1, there are two streams in the gospel. One is righteousness from God is revealed, and it is by faith. We're going to go back to that stream in a little while. The other stream is the wrath of God is also being revealed. Both are being revealed from heaven. And that needs to be handed over to that which we have chosen. Both are a process that takes place in this life. That in chapter 3. Chapter 2 continues, by the way, to explain the judgment of God in different ways. And we won't have time to look more at that. But in chapter 3, verse 21, that now a righteousness from God is being made known. And that's what we'll look at in the third session. That talks now about the cross of Jesus Christ and how the cross of Jesus Christ restores the righteousness of God in the human experience. Okay, I've talked all the time. I probably talk quickly, maybe too fast. If you want to have a look at these slides because you missed something, that's okay. Let's do that, of course. But let's just pray together. Lord Jesus, we acknowledge so easily, I acknowledge so easily how possible it is to exchange a truth or the truth for a lie. You give me sometimes a little thing and I switch it. And I begin to follow something that isn't true, that isn't real.